Hello and welcome to Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodity space. My name is Jesse Day. Before we dive in, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's episode is sponsored by ARC Silver Gold Osmium. They offer personalized service and competitive prices with no minimum purchase for silver, gold, platinum, or osmium. Here's just some of the comments left on this YouTube channel about ARC SGO and owner Ian Everard. Have bought from ARC, good source and price. I cannot say enough good about Ian and his company. He is the most honest individual I could find in order to buy precious metals. If you are looking to buy precious metals, I recommend Ian at ARC Silver. He is a straight shooter. So go to arcsgo.com and contact Ian Everard today at 307 264 9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com and make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. And today's guest is an economist at the Heritage Foundation and the host of the St Onge podcast, where he interprets news on the economy in plain English without the jargon and doublespeak to show you what they're trying to do to you. It is St Onge. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Jesse.
Yes, delighted to have you on. It was our mutual friend Dave Collum who suggested I reach out to you, and I'm very glad I did. So I want to start by kind of clearing something up, because in the tagline for your podcast, you say you're trying to show people what they're trying to do to you. So I'm wondering, when we refer to them, who are they really? Because are we talking about the politicians themselves? Are we talking about central bankers? Are we talking about a small cartel of people who were kind of behind the scenes and never reveal themselves publicly? Who are they?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, it's the latter. So you've got people who are united by the profits involved in controlling the government. They don't necessarily seek fame. George Soros, for example, does not go out of his way necessarily to, he isn't Elon Musk or Donald Trump. He's not out on the podcast every week and such. These are generally people who they have some interest in government policy. They've found some way to benefit from it. And I don't think they're necessarily evil per se. They're looking to make money. And, there's wars make money. There may be individuals who promote wars. I think they probably don't sit there and giggle at all the people who die. They just don't really care that much given the profits involved. So, I think broadly speaking, it's not that they hide so much as it's just not part of their business plan to necessarily become famous. What they've got in mind is, political donations, political pressure campaigns, funding activists. If you take green energy, for example, that's a real clear example. So you've got people who build solar companies, or wind farms, and the return on investment for them putting some money into politics is just astounding. I mean, it's like 10 to 1. This is, one of the funny mysteries of political science is that for regular people, they're sort of shocked how much money is in politics. But if you actually look at the rate of return on investment, I mean, holy cow, you can donate like $1 million to a mayor and you can make 10 times your return. I think the shocking thing for people in politics is how little money there is in it. Like, why, it's free money. And, sadly, the rest of us have to pick up the pieces afterwards.
And is there not a motivation with some of these people for power as well as profits? Because it's the only way to explain a lot of the policies that get implemented. And I have a theory that a lot of people in political power, whether the people behind the scenes are the same, they seem to be more susceptible to being narcissists, sociopaths, perhaps even psychopaths in some cases. What are your thoughts there? Is it all about profits? Is there a quest for power as well? How do those two interplay with each other?
Yeah, so in economics, you're trying to understand why people do things. And one thing that motivates people is money. But another thing that motivates them is psychic benefits of things. Things like being loved, being celebrated, having power over other people. And unfortunately, what distinguishes government from every other sort of legitimate function of human activity is that government can use violence, right? So if Microsoft wants to sell you a product in the sort of competitive market, they're supposed to appeal to you and try to convince you to buy it, and they have to persuade you. Government, of course, doesn't have to do that, right? Government has a exclusive monopoly over the legitimate use of violence. This is what distinguishes organizations called governments from organizations called, say, companies or associations and so on. So that industry, right, any industry where the core product is controlling other people, that is going to attract a certain type of individual. So without a doubt, I think politics sort of starts off suspect in a way that it does attract the wrong type of people. And then the fact that violence is so profitable, right? If you can force people to buy your product, you can print money, right? So when you combine those two factors, it's just a irresistible cocktail that it draws in the absolute worst of humanity.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I want to get your view as an economist on this video that's been circulating online. It's completely insane. It's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors to Biden, Jared Bernstein. This guy couldn't even grasp the concept of money printing and debt issuance by the government. He was left completely bewildered, having to almost ask himself questions. It's a bizarre thing to see. And then at the end of himself being so confused, he declared, "I don't see anything confusing about it." It was like the most bizarre. I'm like, what is happening? It almost seemed like a parody, like a skit or something like that. Halen's razor that this states to never attribute to malice what can be attributed to stupidity. Is this where we're at? Are the people in control really this ignorant? Is it all an act? What's going on here?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of malice and stupidity. So, so the guy in question is sort of the chief economist of the Biden administration. He's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. This is supposed to be like a Jedi council, like this sort of set of gurus who are above politics, and they just have the giant brains, and they tell us all how to run the economy. And so it's a little shocking how stupid this guy is. I mean, literally, what did he say, that the government issues bonds so it can lend money, right? Which is not how debt works, right? Debt is for borrowing money. Debt is not for lending money. I mean, the guy just, like your average dog walker is going to have a better understanding of how money and debt works. So I think that shocked a lot of people. But really, I think what's happening in this particular case is that you've got these ideological diversity hires throughout the administration where, traditionally, the way that you would get onto the board of the Federal Reserve or onto the CEA would be that you had to be a pretty good economist, and you had to be, kind of the two-handed economist, like on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And I think that really what's happened, particularly on the left, is that it has simply become an ideological project at this point. It really doesn't matter if you understand debt or even what a bond is. The fundamental question is, are you part of the revolution? Have you signed on? And in this guy's case, he's got a PhD in social work or something. He should have never been on there in the first place. But his entire career is built on kvetching about inequality and how, the government has to control business because, free market is going to lead to inequality. And of course, it's the government who causes the inequality because private companies bid for government favor and then use that government favor to attack their enemies. Alternatively, the Fed, of course, prints money and pumps it out to rich people via asset markets. So, the entire sort of inequality industrial complex is based on the exact opposite of reality. But that's how this guy made his name. It's why he collects a $400,000 taxpayer salary over, he's been on a long list of prestigious universities. The guy's an idiot, right? So you might think he shouldn't be teaching at Columbia, but that ain't how it works anymore, right? As long as you are signed on card-carrying member of the revolution, it does not matter how many IQ points you have. And so what I was just going to add, that makes it a little bit scary, right? Because I think many of us imagine that, maybe we have a difference of opinion, maybe we read the data differently on what caused the Great Depression or whatever, but, at least these people are quasi-competent. They're capable of, sailing the ship without it flipping over. So I think for a lot of us, it's almost scary to realize how incredibly stupid these people have become. They honestly have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. And ideology has kind of taken over logic. which kind of makes sense in a way. I was watching an interview with like a former spy for the CIA, and he said when you've got an asset, like somebody that you're trying to convince to do something for you, the most powerful driver for humans is ideology. It seems that's become very heavy in many governments around the world now. I want to get your thoughts on gold, and kind of specifically, there's a lot of talk, kind of perhaps idealistic talk out there in the sound money community. I think Bitcoiners might also believe something similar as a lot of gold bugs, despite the fact that they tend to fight all the time online. And that is that, okay, it's the problem is that we don't have sound money. We've been on a fiat currency system, since some would say since Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, some would go back further than that. And that if we return sound money, such as gold, to the economy, and we start using it again, that's going to fix a lot of the corruption and a lot of the issues. Do you believe that? Is it fundamentally much more complicated than that? And how do you see gold's role kind of in the world moving forward?
Yeah, I think sound money is a massive part of it. If we, put a round number on it, probably about half of the growth of government is effectively coming from the Fed's ability to print unlimited amounts of money. That means that you can have these massive deficits, and the Fed essentially just prints up the difference. So I think our government would be much, much smaller. If you look at the growth of government, both the size of it, the deficits, of course, and the debt, you look at the scope of government, how many things it controls, right? If you look at that before Nixon and after Nixon, it is a completely different reality, right? The government has just grown like an absolute beast. If you go back to what you were referring to earlier, FDR, when FDR first broke gold, you look at before FDR, well, before World War I was sort of set a process in motion that culminated in FDR. Before World War I, we were looking at about 5% of GDP, less than 5% going to the federal government, right? That was an era of hard money. They did not have the money to interfere the way that they do today. You look at it today, and what the federal government, Biden wants 7.3 trillion. It's about a third of GDP that he wants to spend. Of course, a lot of it, he's not even going to bother, he's going to take it in deficit. So if you look at the before and after what the world looked like under hard money, it's a massive difference. Now, if you zoom out from the government, you look at the actual economy itself. Before we broke the gold standard, we were living in the golden age of all of human existence, right? You look at the late 19th century, I like to call it the top hat singularity. All right, we invented everything in that era. You take every single business that Elon Musk does, everything from rockets to pneumatic tubes. He's got the the Hyperloop. Every single business he's in was invented in the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s. Magnetism, airplanes, gasoline, it's just everything was invented in this very short period. And the reason was because we had sound money. Sound money gave us a tiny government, so the free market was able to work. You did not have, today, if you start like a restaurant, I don't know, you've probably got like 8 agencies that are sitting around checking on you. You've got, new regulations every single year. That's for something simple like a restaurant. Now, if you imagine doing something like Neuralink, all right, in the late 1800s, you just stink and do it, all right? And if you hurt anybody, then you're going to have to pay liability and you're going to get punished for that, all right? But other than that, you don't ask any permission. So if you look at how the world worked when we had hard money, I think without a doubt, you could say it will fix a huge, huge amount of problems. If I had to put a number on it, it would fix half of the problems in the world.
And do you still see silver as a monetary metal as well, and as part of the equation? Obviously, it has a massive industrial use. A lot of people now viewing it as more of an industrial metal. A lot of talk about its use in solar panels, etc., but it's used in everything. It's one of the most used commodities in the world. But we don't see central banks accumulating it. We don't see it classified as a tier 1 asset. What is your thoughts on silver? Still money, or just an industrial commodity at this point?
Yeah, so I think silver personally is a lot closer to oil. It's a very important commodity. It will have value. It may go up in price, especially if the world economy keeps growing. But fundamentally, I think the issue with silver is the stock to flow ratio, right? And that's not new. I mean, that's been the case for 200 years. That was a big way that Britain sort of conquered the world, is that Britain had harder money. They had gold. Places like China use silver. What stock to flow means is how much is produced every year versus how much is in existence. And for silver, that's a pretty crappy ratio. I mean, it's probably not far from oil. Gold, on the other hand, something like 1.5% of all the gold in existence is produced every year. So you've got a very, very attractive stock to flow ratio. Silver, from memory, might be like 20 or 40%. It may even be higher. Bitcoin, of course, with the halving, Bitcoin is now harder than gold. Now, Bitcoin has existential questions. Will it be banned? Does it have some unforeseen technological flaw? So yes, there are additional risks in Bitcoin, but of course the upside is also much, much higher given that Bitcoin is a much smaller market. So personally, I see Bitcoin as a potential money, gold as a potential money. I do not see silver as a potential money. It may well go up in price, as might oil. Of course, you can store silver at home more easily than you can store oil, but I don't think it's ever going to be a money again. I think it's going to be bounced either by gold or by Bitcoin.
And what are your thoughts on this kind of talk of de-dollarization and gold's return to the monetary system? Potentially, well, the main driver for this is obviously the BRICS nations and their desire to move outside of the US dollar system, particularly since the US frees Russian FX reserves. And so people are now getting concerned about, who knows who's the next political opponent. And we're seeing central banks accumulating gold at a record pace. A lot of people are saying that is because they are preparing for some sort of shift in the monetary system that favors gold. Others are saying they're just protecting themselves. It's a better alternative to treasuries at this point. What are your thoughts on the whole de-dollarization talk and the BRICS nations potentially coming out with an alternate currency using gold?
Yeah, so you've got two questions here. So one of them is what's going on with dollarization, with central bank behavior in the short run. And then you got a separate question on gold's prospects as a money. So dealing with the first, right, China is trying to erode the US dollar's global reserve currency status. The US gets a huge benefit from that. China would like to end that. It also means that China, or the US rather, has a lot of power over other countries, right? So the US can impose sanctions and that can hit countries in a way that other countries cannot. So China would like to erode that. Now, China's got a lot of its issues at the moment. Its economy is not doing that great because it had too much central planning. But at any rate, China's been pushing for that. Russia, of course, is on board. Russia is also pretty distracted at the moment. I think that the strongest prospects for the BRICS coalition, for China's group of countries, the biggest prospects for them to knock out the dollar would be if they came out with some sort of a gold rail. Okay, so some sort of a trade currency. This would not be their own native currency, right? Because all these countries want weak currencies so that their exports are cheap. In fact, the US and China fight over that all the time, just like the US and Japan used to fight over it. So China wants a weak currency at home. But the question is, do they develop some kind of gold-backed currency that they only use for trade? If they do, that would be an absolute game changer. They know it. They've been talking about it for better part of a decade. Both Russia and China have been talking about having a gold-backed currency. That, I think, would be absolutely fascinating. I think it would be wonderful for humanity. It'd be bad for the U.S. government. It would also be a problem for American citizens because if it catches on, then it means a whole bunch of dollars would come flooding back to the U.S. There's something like 2 to 3 times as many dollars in existence as Americans actually use at home, right? So if foreigners start switching over to some kind of BRICS currency. In fact, if they switch over to gold or Bitcoin, then that is going to dramatically reduce the value of a dollar. It'll lead to a lot of inflation here. So I think those are the dynamics there. In the near term, China and Russia are both very distracted. It would take moving heaven and earth. It would also take a lot of trust for, people would actually have to believe in this gold-backed rail. Like they would have to believe that they could take their paper BRICS currency and go actually trade that for gold that they could, drop on their foot. China is one of the least trustworthy countries in the world for good reason. So I think they've got a long ways to go on that, nothing dramatic is probably going to happen within a decade, I think. In terms of the broader question on gold's prospects as money, if we go back through history, paper money has always died. I think the average lifespan is something like 40 years, so we're already overdue. Notably, we've never, ever had it where every single country in the world is on paper money. Okay, this is an absolute first. People in previous generations would have thought that is absolutely insane. I do think that it'll eventually collapse. I think it's starting to accelerate. What'll probably collapse it is just the money printing. So, the national debts get so big, they're obviously not going to be paid back. And so it becomes overwhelmingly tempting for governments to inflate it away. Once they get to 7%, 8%, 9%, right? Government just wants to keep pushing it up. And at some point, people lose faith. Once you lose that faith, you get this giant rush out of the currency, what Ludwig von Mises called the flight to real values. Once that takes off, it accelerates. You go from like 20% inflation a year to billions of percent. This happened many, many times. In fact, it happens in countries as we speak. So, I think that's the end game. The question is, when does that occur? The question is also, what do we do after that? Right. And, historically, we would have always gone to gold after that. There's a separate question whether we go to Bitcoin at this point. That has to do with the timing. If you look at the gold price, so my estimation is that almost the entire value of gold is a speculative bet that gold is going to become money someday. If you break down gold and compare it to other metals that have similar markets, similar demand, jewelry, industrial, and so on. In other words, if you strip out the investment demand for gold, I think the intrinsic value of gold is probably on the order of 1% to 2% of its current price. So $20 or $30, something like that. The rest of it is all speculation that it will eventually become money. So at that point, you ask, as a gold investor, you say, okay, well, if gold became money, right? So all the money in the world currently is about 120 trillion. All the gold in the world is about 14 trillion. So if almost the entire value of gold is a bet that it will someday become money, then implicitly gold buyers are saying, we think there's a 12% chance that gold will eventually become money, right? That's discounted because when is it going to occur and net present value and things like that. But just kind of to get a big picture view on it. So gold, according to the market price, stands a 12% chance of someday replacing paper. Bitcoin, for what it's worth, stands, about, I'm trying to think what the price is at the moment. Anyway, about a 1% chance, right? So if you as an investor believe that there's more than a 12% chance that gold becomes money or more than a 1% chance that Bitcoin becomes money, then you should buy it. Now, in my opinion, it is almost guaranteed. The only question is the timing, right? I would not be surprised if Fiat took 20 years to collapse. I'd be very surprised if it took 3 years to collapse. I'd also be pretty surprised if it took 80 years to collapse. But that's a heck of a range, right? If you're an investor and you're interested, if you're going to buy a stock because it's going to pay off in 20 years, you should probably hold off on buying it for a while. I think that kind of sketches out the cost benefits there for an investor looking at the gold or the Bitcoin market.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard it put that way, that the price of gold is based on the potential of it becoming money in the future. Obviously, a very long track record of being money. I find the Bitcoin piece of the puzzle very interesting. People hate it when I talk about Bitcoin on this show for whatever reason. A lot of gold bugs and silver bugs watch. But I do want to shift to commodities more broadly. And I wonder if you watch the commodities space. There's this narrative out there that there's a coming commodity super cycle because of years of underinvestment. Partially, some people look at the green energy revolution and factor that in because of all the minerals required to bring a lot of these so-called renewable energy systems online as well. We've already seen commodities like uranium perform very well over the past several years. Copper doing very well at the moment. Obviously, gold breaking out to new all-time highs. Silver looking quite strong as well. And energy, I think, has a huge upside potential from here and has also done well over the past several years. How do you see the commodities space more broadly? Do you think we are headed for a long-term bull cycle in commodities in general?
Yeah, so depending on the commodity, of course, you've got various dynamics in there. And as you say, green energy, there is just an absolute ton of money being plowed into that, taxpayer money being wasted, in my opinion. But anyway, it drives up demand. And so, a lot of these things, lithium and cobalt and all those, the question there, of course, is everybody knows this. So if everybody knows this, is already priced into into the commodity itself. But sort of zooming out, I'm not a huge fan of the super cycle thesis, just because I think that what is going to end up driving it a lot more, if we look back to the really big cycles in commodity prices, it's tough to beat the 1970s. And I think that inflation really just dominates the discussion. The inflation or the price rises, they're not going to be uniform across the board because you've got those sort of idiosyncratic factors. You got green investment coming out, or whatever, you have companies divesting from natural gas or whatever it is. Transportation, the Suez Canal that impacts LNG tankers. You've got all these sort of fun little dynamics playing along the way. But I think fundamentally, for me anyway, commodity prices boils down to inflation. If you look out over the 50-year period, aside from inflation, generally commodity prices tend to go down. And the reason is because humans invent new things, right? I mean, every user of an expensive commodity, they are constantly they're incentivized to replace that commodity with something cheaper, right? If you look at gold, for example, you look at the kinds of things that gold went into 100 years ago. For example, telephones, right? Telephones all used to contain enormous amounts of gold. I remember back in the 90s even, there was a huge market for telephone scrap. Right, they would take like just clunky old, dinky looking phones, and they would ship those over to China, and guys would sit there and pull it apart to get at the gold. Right, gold is not used in those kinds of base appliances anymore because it was replaced by things. So I think in the long run, commodities are on a downward trend. If you go back to the 1200s, commodities were much, much more expensive in terms of, say, dollars per hour that it would take you, to afford a metal shovel or something, right, compared to what it costs you today. But having said, what commodities, in my opinion, are really useful from an investment perspective is that they are a free-based way to play inflation, right? So depending on, if you're talking about gold, of course, it's a massive impact. Oil is attenuated a little bit depending on what's happening in the world economy. And of course, when you have high inflation, that tends to be bad for the economy. And so high inflation doesn't tend to hit oil as well. But yeah, for me, that's really the star of the show. And I do think that we're in for a long period of higher inflation. I think that central banks have lost the plot really worldwide, the major central banks anyway. And at this point, I think the next move is most likely the central banks are going to try to sell the electorate on permanently higher rates of inflation. If you're moving from a 2% regime to a 3% regime on inflation, that sort of thing is going to get capitalized into commodity prices. And there, I think we could definitely see a jump.
So where would you look for value in the markets today? You say you think inflation could push commodities forward. Maybe firstly, if there's any specific commodities you could hone in on that you think might benefit the most from that. And then also anywhere outside the commodity space that you think could potentially present a compelling value proposition at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, the question is always what you're hedging and what the risks are. So usually when I look at investing, I kind of take it from a top-down perspective where I'm trying to ask first, where are we in the economic cycle, right? So you've got the boom bust cycle. It's not natural. It's central bank formed, but anyway, it exists. So where are we in the boom bust cycle? And I think where we are right now is between late boom and early bust. That's probably the kind of place that you don't want to be in equities. You also don't want to be in growth commodities, so things like copper and oil, historically. Of course, geopolitical effects can dominate all of that. But I would stay away from those. I would generally probably park in something more defensive, inflation hedges, gold, Bitcoin. Housing historically has held up very well. If we look over a 100-year period, for example, housing, almost like clockwork, it holds up about 1% above inflation. I think one of the big questions right now is what's going to happen to housing, right? We just had this huge run up. But of course, if you adjust for inflation, housing has not had much of a run up. Inflation is up at least a third, depending on whose numbers you believe. Housing is up a little bit more than that. I think about 40%. That's something like 5% in real terms. So housing is actually not all that expensive. inflation is expensive and inflation is feeding through into everything else. And of course, it's capitalizing in houses. So I still think that housing is most likely a sound investment. It could collapse. As always, don't take any of this as advice. Do your own research. Who knows? I could be completely blindsided, but broadly speaking, I think a house is a safe place to park. Another thing that I think a lot of people overlook is that when you have high inflation, actually stocks are not that bad, right? Stocks do terribly when the economy goes south, right? Typically they lose about 30, 45%. But in terms of inflation hedge, early in Weimar Germany, they were not talking about how expensive groceries were. They were talking about how their stocks were going up, right? Stocks capitalize any future movements. They capitalize future inflation. So honestly, if you're looking for a hyperinflationary future, buy stocks. If you think the economy is going to absolutely collapse before then hold off for a minute. But if you think the next move is hyperinflation, sure, buy gold, buy your inflation hedges. Always buy housing as long as rates are low, because the Fed is basically giving you the money for free. But beyond that, personally, I just park it in stocks.
Interesting. I wonder, you were speaking about hyperinflation there for a moment. Is that how all of this ends, the debt-based system that we currently find ourselves under? Obviously, as you mentioned, it's a question of timing. Nobody ever knows how long it's going to take for the party to stop. How bad could it be? How dramatic could it be when this system comes to an end? Can they grind this out for longer than people think? The Japan model. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think they're absolutely going to try to keep grinding it out. And I think they are going to squeeze a number of years out of it. I think, when we talk about hyperinflation, in a way, it's not as bad as it sounds. Because I think right now a lot of people are going to be pissed off at the podcast. But anyway, okay, what I'm getting at is, if you look at countries like Brazil or Argentina, for example, life did go on. Right? I mean, people, were still eating, people still had jobs, banks were still there. You go to a restaurant and yes, they were erasing the prices and rewriting them every 45 minutes, but life does continue. I think, when people, especially like Americans, for example, people who have not had experience with hyperinflation, we have a tendency to go directly to the Weimar experience, where you had a lot of violence. Of course, it led to what happened next in Germany, although granted, that was a good, 12 years after the hyperinflation. That you even had the run up the war. But at any rate, people do tend to look towards the most catastrophic. I think in a sense, if you look back to the Great Depression or you look to recent hyperinflations, it is very dramatic on the surface. But the core question is the underlying sort of culture, spirit of trust, how much economic freedom people have to cope with it, right? So what I'm getting at is that, like in the 1930s, for example, there was essentially no starvation in America, by all accounts, right? The media would have put that up front and center if there was. Nobody was starving. The most iconic, picture from the 1930s, the sort of miserable looking woman looking off in the distance, she was literally on vacation. Her husband was changing the car tire and she was bored. She was not starving. She was out on a picnic. I mean, there was a surprisingly low amount of suffering. Yes, people were clipping their coupons and, eating the ends of the bread and whatnot. But I think what got us through the Depression was that the American people have just one heck of a resilient culture. We always have. It's how we became number one in the world. So I think, honestly, if things do collapse here, in many ways, I think it's actually good, right? I mean, the government's not going to have money to pay the EPA inspectors. They're going to have to pull back in and save their cash for the Praetorian Guard. In many ways, the man gets off our back. If you've ever been to like a libertarian festival or something like Pork Fest or Burning Man or something, I mean, there's quite a lot happening. And the reason, of course, is that you don't have regulators going around checking everybody. So in some ways, I think we might actually look forward to it. I think what would be potentially concerning is what a lot of us are seeing now, which is this sort of violence and chaos that almost seems organized. That, I think, is a serious problem. That could get people towards fighting each other. But just, the sort of run-of-the-mill economic catastrophes, depressions, and hyperinflations, people historically, the American people particularly, have bounced right back from that kind of thing.
I want to shift kind of back to the political realm for a second and just talk about kind of this trend I'm seeing of politicians being so brazenly out in the open corrupt. It's kind of crazy. And I mean, I'm from Canada. I fled my country to the Balkans, where I'm currently in Serbia, to get away from it. I was just like, are people really putting up with this? It's funny because when I left Canada after Trudeau got reelected in October 2021, I thought the airport was going to be packed with people leaving the country, because I'm like, surely this is going to be the breaking point for many. Completely empty. I think I was the only person there. It was like, okay, let's get out of here and never come back. But I'm seeing this worrying trend. It's gotten to the point where I think Trudeau could look right into a camera and tell people he's going to send them all to camps, and like nobody would do anything. It seems like people are just so asleep in the Western world. It's almost like a cognitive dissonance. Like, instead of believing that these politicians actually have malicious intentions for you, it's better to play along and pretend that everything is fine. And because if you don't, I realize I'm fortunate that I was able to leave and that I have a job that allows me to work around the world. A lot of people don't have that choice. So I kind of get it. But what are your thoughts there? What will it take for people in the West to kind of wake up to whatever you want to call it, a creeping authoritarianism? There's communist elements to it. There's a feudal element to it. Very interesting, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely true. It's really true across the West for sure, where governments have just become absolutely brazen. I think what happened is the institutional left, they were conducting their long march through the institutions, right? So they took public education, they took the universities, they took media, really across the board. And they thought they were winning, right? And so they were content to just kind of sit back and bide their time and just slowly take over. And I think what happened was two events in 2016, which were Brexit and Trump's winning. In both cases, the entire institutional left in both Britain and America put everything they had into that, right? It was Operation Fear, just convince everybody that the world will burn if you elect this guy or if you vote for Brexit. And it didn't work, right? And I think that was really a shock for the institutional left. At that point, they said, okay, we're not winning anymore. Actually, we're losing. It's not working. And so at that point, they threw off the mask. And in particular, I think journalism threw off the mask as an institution, right? So journalism has always been left wing, but it's been like 70, 75% left wing, right? They still had, they would still criticize a liberal or a Democrat politician. Bill Clinton got savaged in the media, for example, right? So they were mostly left, but they were still kind of feeling that, we got to keep our credibility with the audience. And so they were just kind of steering it. And once they came to that 2016 moment, you can call it the Trump or the Brexit moment, depending which country you're in. I think that, everything just flipped and they said, all right, we just have to throw everything we have, forget future credibility, forget what happens tomorrow. The war is now. So in a way, I think it's like we had this creeping fifth column and they were going to wait for the signal to launch the revolution. And for whatever reason, they had to launch it too soon. Okay. And then COVID was the first opportunity they had, I think, to really, really complete the revolution. And, again, just the backlash was absolutely massive. If I take the U.S., there was this moment, I don't remember what it was, but like Monday morning, Democrats were all, we gotta do stricter lockdowns, whatnot. And then a bunch of opinion polls came out. Wednesday morning, all the main politicians were, COVID's over. Everybody's sick of this. And by gum, boy, democracy worked. They all changed their tune and pretended that, they'd never, ever said all the things they've been saying for the previous year. So, I think that we still have enough Democratic remnants in our country. Of course, it's biased. Of course, people are brainwashed by education and media. But we still have enough in there that when things get bad enough, the people, they walk away from the left. And, that's happening, I think, in droves at this point. Really, certainly across the left. Now, we've got a large installed base of brainwashed leftoids to work through. So, we could still be losing elections for a while here. But you've got people converting over by the millions. So I am still hopeful. You know, sure, elections are stolen. There's all kinds. But in the grand scheme of history, when you look at other periods where liberty has been threatened, we have just one heck of a lot more advantages, right? We've got the internet. We've got guys like Elon Musk. Even before Elon was here, we had, you know, a whole bunch of, you know, you had like Telegram and what is it, Gab, Rumble, right? You had various ways to get the message out. If you compare this to what people had to do in like, you know, like the 1830s or something, I mean, you know, where everything was censored and you had no internet. You, in many countries, you had no election. You didn't even have biased elections. You had no election whatsoever. There were a lot of countries where until very recently, if you criticized the government, you would literally be shot. So, you know, if you sort of look at the gains in liberty in those eras where they were working with so much less, okay, and then you compare with what we have today, yeah, of course, the playing field is, you know, slanted against us all the time, but compared to our forebears, we are in really, really good shape. So honestly, I think we are absolutely going to win. They have all the money, they have all the power, they have all the levers. They brainwash each generation of kid, just cranking them out assembly style. Nonetheless, I am certain we're going to win because they can't control themselves, right? If you look at the gender debate, for example, if I were on their side, I'd be like, what in the heck are you? What? Like, I mean, you got to be kidding, right? They can't say no to the activists. And, you know, I think one of the funny things, just kind of as an aside here, I won't take up too much time, but cheating on elections, because I know that that's a big topic in the US. I suspect it might be in Canada as well, given the CBC. The funny thing about cheating with elections is that the reason you do it is so that you can ignore the other side's voters, right? But the thing is that once you start cheating in elections, you can ignore all the voters, right? Because every political party is a permanent civil war between its activists and its donors and its sort of elite and the base who go out there and give them the votes, right? They are permanently, they hate each other, right? Every political party, they cannot stand each other, right? So if let's say hypothetically, the Democrat Party in the US starts cheating on elections, then we know exactly what happens because this happened to hundreds of countries in Africa, Latin America, and all over the place. What happens is they end up choosing policies that nobody in the entire country likes. Their approval ratings go to Joe Biden levels, 30%, 20%. They keep going down. And there comes a moment where even the people who are counting the votes, right, the paid guys who are sitting there, you know, pulling a bunch of votes out of their back pocket, even they cannot be sure that they're not going to be arrested after the election, right? There's some point where they're sitting there thinking, well, nobody likes this guy. I don't know anybody who likes this guy. I don't like this guy. Is he really going to win? I know we're stuffing ballots, but is he really going to win? So those guys, they stop. They say, no, man, no, I can't do that. It's not right. All of a sudden they grow a conscience because they're afraid of being arrested after the election. So even if they are cheating, it's a pain in the butt because, you know, you get like 20 years after, you know, of that process running its way through. So I would prefer they not cheat. But at any rate, even if they do cheat, it's not the end of the world. Fundamentally, as they screw things up, the people are waking up. The media, by throwing off its mask, it can't even influence a lot of people anymore, right? Like something like 40% of Americans now, if you tell them the media is complete garbage and everything they say is a lie, they'll be like, well, of course it is. Okay. Before 2016, that was not the case. That was like a crazy person point of view, right? So I think that they're basically firing all of their ammunition at once in this sort of panic, and they're running out. So I am absolutely optimistic that we are going to win.
That is an awesome note to end it on. Love the optimism. And I also love the zooming out and kind of going, well, if we look throughout history, we're actually in one of the most free times ever with the least amount of violence. If we actually just zoom out, it's tough for people to think beyond their own lifespans, but our lifespans are but a speck of time in the fabric of human history. Well, Peter, it's been an amazing conversation. For those who want to hear more from you, tell us about your podcast and anywhere else you want to direct people online.
Yep, I do daily videos on economics and freedom. Those go up on X, the formerly known as Twitter. And then I also post them every week as a podcast. So you can find that at peterstonge.com. And then I also do articles every week. So always on economics and liberty, similar to the stuff that we talked about here.
Awesome. Well, I'll put links to the podcast and your X as well. Is that where the articles get published as well? Do you post them on Twitter?
Yeah. Everything goes up on Twitter nowadays. If anybody listening is not on Twitter, it's fantastic. That's really, I think, where the community and the discussion is moving now.
Awesome. Well, links will be in the description. Thank you once again, Peter, for coming on and sharing your knowledge with the audience.
It's been a pleasure, Jesse.
And thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, this episode is sponsored by ARC Silver Gold Osmium. If you're looking to purchase precious metals, head to arcsgo.com and contact owner Ian Everard today at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com, and be sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.